Okay, this is Slavery in the Colonies Part 2, and it gets into a lot more elaborate aspects of the slave trade, starting with this. Now remember, the initial slave trade in Virginia did not have that many. But over time, from 1500 to 1860, approximately 11 million Africans would be kidnapped and taken to the New World. Most of those would be in Latin America, approximately 400,000 in North America, but 2 million of them, of the 11 million originally kidnapped, 2 million of them wouldn't even make it there. They would die on the voyage. Now, for the sake of historical accuracy, there is something that has to be cleared up. The first slave traders were not just European. The first slave traders were Africans who often sold other Africans, usually members of a rival tribe, to the European and American slave traders. So Africans themselves were profiting from the slave trade in a lot of cases as well. The vast majority of slaves would come from the west coast of Africa right here on what became known as the Middle Passage of the Triangle Trade. Now, the Triangle Trade was pretty simple. Slaves would be brought to the Caribbean where they would get what they wanted, slaves. In exchange, people in the Caribbean, or North America for that matter, would give the slave trader sugar, coffee, and tobacco, all things that the Europeans wanted. And when the boat would arrive in Europe, it would drop off the sugar, coffee, and tobacco, and then pay the slave trader in things that the Africans would want, textiles, brandy, and arms, all things that African slave traders would want for themselves. So the triangle trade worked out pretty well for everybody involved, except, of course, the slaves. People in the Western Hemisphere got what they wanted in slaves. People in Europe got what they wanted in sugar, coffee, and tobacco. And African slave traders got textiles, brandy, and arms, things that they wanted. There was also money exchanged along the way. But the thing we want to focus on now, of course, is this, what came to be known as the Middle Passage of the Triangle Trade. And the Middle Passage was exceptionally brutal. The slaves would be packed in like herring, laying down for most of the trip over choppy water, creating seasickness and all sorts of other issues like that, and would be packed in on multiple decks, as you can see here, because the slave traders were trying to maximize their profits by putting as much quote-unquote cargo in their holds as they could. And as far as the conditions in those cargo holds, it was absolutely brutal. They were packed into the holds. They were branded a lot of times. They were chained up. The cargo holds were steamy from the humidity. They were unsanitary. The rolling waves often caused seasickness. They obviously weren't allowed to go to the bathroom in an actual bathroom itself. It just happened right in there. They might have diseases. The cargo holds were just absolutely brutal in terms of sanitation, and death rates would go up to around 20%. If you were deemed to be sick, you just simply weren't fed. When they brought around, you basically held your hands out and they'd put slop in your hands to eat. But if you were deemed to be sick, you weren't worth the food. They would just bypass you. And it turns into a matter of starvation and survival in the holds. I mean, people who were not given food because they were deemed to be ill are trying to kill other people who do have the food, trying to get it away from them. Adults are trying to share with their children, and it's literally just slop on your hands that you're licking off of your own fingers and eating out of your own palm and trying to provide some for your baby or your child, while others who aren't getting food at all because they've been deemed sick are trying to maybe kill your child or kill you to try to get the food away from them or get the food away from you. Because frankly, we're human, and starvation and lack of water can lead survival instincts to kick in, no matter how much you like the person next to you. In cargo holds on the Middle Passage, a lot of times it came down to my survival versus yours, and it turned into survival of the fittest. If you didn't get food and you were continually branded as being sick, well, then eventually you were a wasted investment. They weren't going to spend the money on food on you, so they would tie you to rocks and throw you overboard in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's how your life would end. Survivors who did manage to get through the Middle Passage, possibly having lost friends or spouses or children along the way. I mean, imagine going through all of that and seeing all of that happen in front of you. Maybe your baby is one that is thrown overboard, or your child, or your father, or your mother. Imagine seeing all that and having the reward that you get for surviving it be being put up on an auction block on the Atlantic coast somewhere, all the way from Rhode Island to South Carolina. You were considered property, and you probably had survived and seen too much already just coming across the Atlantic. But now, since you were property, you would be inspected. Your muscles, your teeth, anything that would indicate illness, how strong you seem to be, what purpose an owner might have for you. You were purchased that way without any consideration of what might happen. So you might survive the voyage with your parents after having watched some siblings go over the side of the boat for being too sick. You might make it all the way to the New World and then be put on the auction block and be separated from your parents forever, or parents separated from their children forever, because there was no interest in keeping families together. From the business aspect of things, well, by 1698, the Royal African Company would lose its monopoly on taking slaves to the New World. Previously, or prior to that, they were the only company that had been able to do it. But when they lost their monopoly on it, many Americans were now cashing in on the slave trade, which led to a boom of slave trading in North America and not just the Caribbean. By 1750, African slaves would become half of the population in Virginia, and in South Carolina, they would outnumber whites 2-1. Great Britain would eventually outlaw the slave trade entirely in 1807, but this is key to understand. Kids get confused on this all the time. It did not outlaw slavery where it already existed. Now, the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron would go around seizing hundreds of ships that were still illegally trying to transport slaves to the New World after the 1807 ban, and they freed thousands of captives, but as you can imagine, they couldn't get to them all. The United States government followed suit 1 year later in 1808, banning Americans from taking part in the importation of slaves, just basically saying not only will you be in trouble internationally if you participate in the black market slave trade that was banned by the British in 1807, but you'll be in trouble here as well. So the U.S. government banned America's involvement in the slave trade in 1808. But that actually created almost a bigger problem and a bigger boom in the slave trade itself. The slave trade thrived within the United States all the way until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Masters simply bred slaves for sale. Oftentimes, if a woman would be willing to have 10 kids to sell as slaves, she would be given her freedom, which imagine what that would be for somebody, or what that would be like to go through that as a mother. Often free northern blacks were taken to the South to provide labor after the international slave trade became illegal. And as for the life of a slave once they got here, it was just as bad, if not worse. They had already survived being separated from their family, but now they were going to be put to work. Now, this was pretty bad on Virginia tobacco plantations, but it was much worse on South Carolina rice and indigo plantations just because of the climate in South Carolina and the amount of labor needed to do the job on rice and indigo plantations as opposed to tobacco. Tobacco didn't require as much labor, energy, and work, but rice and indigo did. So, family life was a lot more possible in Virginia and the Chesapeake. Tobacco plantations were often closer together, so contact between slaves actually happened a little more often. But South Carolina had all male or mostly male slaves just due to the harsher labor that was involved and needed for rice and indigo. Slaves were also considered valuable investments. They were $1,800 a piece by the dawn of the Civil War in 1860. So for more dangerous jobs, whites would often hire Irish labor to do those because they wanted to protect their investment. That was about the only reason that slaves would be saved by their owners in any particular way. Now, as you can imagine, as a result of this lifestyle, there were a series of slave rebellions that would take place. One of the first ones was in 1712 at the New York slave riot. Slaves rebelled and 9 whites were killed, but as a result, for the rebellion, 20 slaves were very slowly burned at the stake. The Stono River Rebellion in 1739 in South Carolina was another notable one in AP U.S. history. 50 slaves tried a march to Spanish Florida, but they were stopped by the state militia, and many of them sent back into slavery or murdered for leaving. And another notable one for AP U.S. history was Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. 60 Virginians were slaughtered in that rebellion. As you can see here, just read about it if you want to stop at this off-ramp a little bit and learn more about Nat Turner's Rebellion. It's right here. And one of the most popular ones made into a movie was the Amistad Rebellion in 1839. Again, as you can see here, one of the most famous slave rebellions took place in the waters off the coast of Cuba. A series of African Americans, long after the banning of the international slave trade in 1808, were captured and brought to the New World. One African, most people know as Cinque, led 48 Africans in the rebellion, and they took over the ship. Ultimately, what they wanted was for the slave traders to take them back home. They wanted to be taken back to Africa, and the slave traders, and again, there's a language barrier here. They had great difficulties trying to speak the tribal languages, and of course, the Africans didn't understand Spanish. So they did eventually figure out that they wanted the slave traders to take them back to Africa. But the slave traders tricked them. They led the slaves to believe that they were taking them back to Africa and freedom, when in truth they were taking them north to get help from somebody. And when the slaves realized what had happened, they started another rebellion, killing off most of the rest of the crew. Now, this was called the Amistad Rebellion because the name of the ship was the Amistad. However, the slaves couldn't prevent the Amistad from reaching the East Coast, and they were put on trial for murder. But when it was discovered that they had been brought here as a part of the illegal black market slave trade that had been outlawed for 32 years, rather than having been born here, they were set free and taken back on ships to Africa and freedom, hoping to reunite with their families. In most cases, that didn't happen. Cinque searched the rest of his life for his wife and children, but never found them. They had been sold into slavery. Over time, slaves would struggle to maintain their heritage because they simply didn't know what it was. All they knew was that they were African. They didn't know what part of Africa they had come from. They had been brought here and given names by their slave owner. So the owner would simply give them a first name like John, and if the owner's last name was Anderson, then the slave would be known as John Anderson. They completely lost their heritage. The rest of us often don't simply refer to ourselves as European or Asian or Hispanic. We do at times, but we take great pride in knowing that we are German or Irish or Scottish or Chinese or Mexican. But without that luxury, over time, the various African cultures just blended into what becomes African American culture. And it is something to take great pride in. In the 1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement, this man here, who was originally named Malcolm Little, said, "I don't know what my ancestry is, so simply call me Malcolm X," with X being the unknown. It is something that African Americans even still today take great pride in, being proud of being African or African American, even if they don't always know exactly where that traces back to. That's it. Thanks for listening.